Loretta Mills cradled the frayed stethoscope beneath her chin and pressed the earpieces to the cold metal shell of the hybrid drive. The engine room fell deathly quiet, save for her breath. Around her, 10 Navy engineers and civilian technicians froze in their tracks as their evening chatter died on their lips. Behind them, Lieutenant Darby scoffed, voice laced with disbelief. "This is a joke, right?" Loretta didn't flinch. The hum of failure vibrated through her fingertips as she closed her eyes, hunting for something only she could hear. An echo of her father's voice from the old garage in Norfolk. She listened, heart steady as steel, and quietly thought, "This ship, she isn't broken. She's afraid." Immediately, the collective tension shivered through the cramped steel walls. Loretta inhaled deeply, tracing the rhythm of hidden currents beneath her touch. Every other engineer waited for data, for screens to flicker alive. But she didn't need them. She only needed to listen. Her fingertips found a faint resonance near a cooling relay. In that instant, the hybrid heart of the USS Hian seemed to exhale, as though relieved to be finally heard. The USS Hian had been adrift for 3 days, a $4,300,000,000 zero-cent warship lying still under a vast Pacific sky, her sleek frame gleaming but hollow, her systems dark, her pride shattered. The sea lapped gently against her steel hull, but inside her belly, frustration boiled louder than any ocean swell. In the control room, Lieutenant Neil Darby sat rigid, sweat pooling at the base of his neck as he repeated the same hollow phrase into a dead console. "Sir, we've lost propulsion again." No one answered, and no one needed to. His words were a formality, the crew already drowned in silent resignation. Captain Joanna Brandt, whose sharp gaze had once cut through the clamor of orders and alarms, now moved with grim precision, her boots ringing out across a floor that felt colder than steel. The main propulsion unit, a hybrid marvel of turbines, gas propulsion, and AI diagnostics, lay dormant. For all its brilliance, it had become a monument to failure. Sophisticated diagnostics ran loops that revealed nothing. Engineers from MIT, contractors from Silicon Valley, and naval specialists with ribbons lying down their uniforms had pored over schematics and stared at lifeless displays for 60 hours straight. Their fingers swiped tablets, keyed in command strings, and reinitialized protocols until every gesture felt empty. The engineers' bodies slumped as their confidence evaporated. Even Petty Officer Jake Morris, normally irrepressible, sat in a corner tracing his boots along the seams of the floor, head bowed. Chief Engineer Bradley Tennyson's face was ashen. He didn't even pretend to offer another guess. The ship was silent, not just from power loss, but from the collective loss of hope. Captain Brandt's jaw tightened as she scanned the pale faces around her. She knew the higher-ups at Point Loma were already demanding answers, demanding accountability. This ship had been sold to the Navy as untouchable, an untiring machine that would outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast any adversary. And now it sat here, a drifting ghost. If the public learned that the Navy's crown jewel had failed, her own career would founder alongside it. She paced briskly through the dim corridor outside the control room, glancing toward the sealed hatch of the engine bay. The heavy air of defeat seemed to seep from every bolt. She stopped short as the intercom crackled faintly. "Captain, Admiral Pike on secure channel. He's authorized an external consultant, civilian status, ETA 5 hours. Brandt's eyes narrowed, but somewhere deep within, a flicker of something, was it hope or just desperation, broke through. Her voice was taut but calm. "Name?" The answer chilled and confused even her. "Loretta Mills." She had heard of Loretta, not a credentialed Navy engineer, not a contractor, not an expert in any formal sense. She was simply the daughter of a legendary but long-forgotten chief mechanic, a woman who had grown up with her hands deep in grease-stained engines, absorbing knowledge not from textbooks but from a man who could listen to machines like others listen to music. Brant exhaled slowly. 5 more hours of a ship in disgrace. 5 more hours of disbelieving stares and quiet despair. Around her, the Hian groaned faintly as a swell nudged her port side. A reminder that nature, at least, still recognized her presence. And while the ship waited, the crew waited too, their faith dwindling. At the heart of the crisis was more than failed machinery. It was the bitter realization that the most brilliant minds and the most advanced systems had been outdone by the inexplicable. And in that void, in that aching pause before the next failed attempt, Brant whispered to herself, "If she can't fix it, no one will." Captain Joanna Brant stood alone in the briefing room, the dim lights overhead humming softly, their glow reflecting off rows of empty chairs. Her fingers drummed the edge of a steel table, a habit she had never indulged in before this endless silence crept through her ship. 1,000 calculations ran through her mind, protocol, politics, prestige, and all of them pointed in one direction. The decision she was about to make would be called reckless, maybe even desperate. The command chain had been clear. If this ship failed so soon after deployment, it would not just be the Navy's reputation that drowned. It would be hers. She remembered every skeptical glance from admirals too comfortable in Washington offices. Every raised eyebrow when she had been appointed so young, so female, to this post. She knew what they would say. She panicked. She broke protocol. She invited liability aboard a billion-dollar warship. But even as the logic swirled around her, Brant felt something deeper tightening in her chest. A memory. Many years before, when she was still a green lieutenant stationed in Norfolk, she had watched an old man with calloused hands and a battered notebook quietly fix an entire engine room no one else could figure out. He never raised his voice, never cited a regulation, but when he tapped a bolt and listened to the vibration, you knew he understood things others couldn't see. That man had been Chief Mills, Loretta's father. Brant's throat tightened as she closed her eyes, imagining his hands, steady and stained with oil, working without hurry, but with absolute certainty. And she remembered a small girl sitting quietly nearby on an upside-down crate, her hair in tight braids, watching her father work, mimicking every movement, every gesture, learning without a single lesson. Loretta Mills, a Navy engineer. No credentials, no security clearance, but Brant had read her file anyway, barely a page long, and tucked in the corner was a note from an old senior chief. If her father taught her anything, it's that machines don't care about your resume. They care if you listen. Brant straightened and spoke into the console. "Have her flown out immediately. Civilian clearance under my authority. I'll answer for it." Across from her, Commander Raj Patel grimaced, folding his arms tight across his chest. His voice, though measured, could not hide the disbelief. "Captain, you're bringing in a mechanic's daughter? No offense, but this isn't exactly a repair shop. This is the Navy's most advanced destroyer. Her expertise is folklore at best." Brant's reply was quiet but final. "So is sitting here while my ship dies, Commander." Patel hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "Yes, ma'am." Brant turned away, hiding the crack in her composure. She walked to the nearest porthole, staring out at a sea that was beginning to feel less like freedom and more like judgment. They would all doubt her, they already did. But deep inside, buried beneath years of training, hierarchy, and doctrine, she felt it again. That instinct that some called reckless, but her father had once called essential. When the numbers stop making sense, when the screens all go dark, you listen, not to the experts, but to what's real. And in this case, what was real was a young woman raised by an old mechanic who understood machines before they learned to talk back. Brant's fingers curled into a fist. 5 hours, she whispered to herself. 5 hours, to brace herself for the looks she would get when Loretta Mills stepped off that helicopter in worn boots and an old jacket and faced a room full of officers who would question her presence before she even spoke a word. But Brant would stand by this decision because it was no longer about command, it was about trust. Trust in something older than protocols. As the intercom clicked off and the paperwork to authorize civilian clearance processed into the system, Brant felt the faintest shift in the air, as though the ship itself was waiting. A reckless decision, maybe, but one she would make again, without hesitation. The Black Hawk helicopter descended hard, its rotors beating against the wind, whipping up spray that lashed across the flight deck and sent sailors ducking beneath their caps. Even as the bird's skids kissed the steel deck with a sharp metallic clatter, most of the crew kept their distance, arms crossed, shoulders hunched, not from formality but from skepticism. They had heard the rumors already. A civilian consultant was coming. Not a contractor, not a defense industry savant, but the daughter of some long-forgotten Navy mechanic. And worse, a woman, barely 30 if that, dragged from obscurity to fix what their best minds could not. Lieutenant Darby muttered under his breath as he adjusted his collar against the wind. "This is a joke, right?" The phrase had become a bitter refrain, passed along corridors, whispered in engine rooms. Then she stepped out. Loretta Mills was smaller than they expected. Wiry but purposeful, her movements compact like an engine tuned for efficiency. A dark navy windbreaker, too large for her slim frame, hung from her shoulders, the sleeves frayed, the cuffs stained with oil that would never come out no matter how hard it was scrubbed. Around her neck dangled a battered stethoscope, its rubber tubing dulled from years of grease and salt air. In one hand she carried a soft leather notebook whose corners were rounded with wear, the pages swollen from old moisture and thumbed so many times they seemed to have softened into fabric. She did not hesitate as she disembarked, boots scuffing slightly on the wet deck, her gaze steady but inward-looking, as though measuring the vibration of the ship itself beneath her feet. Lieutenant Darby stepped forward automatically, his salute stiff and his expression caught between duty and disbelief. "Ma'am, welcome aboard," he said, the words sounding hollow even to himself. Loretta didn't salute back. She didn't nod or smile. She simply spoke in a voice so calm and even it cut through the roar of the helicopter rotors. "Where's the engine room?" The directness stunned them. The assembled officers exchanged glances as though waiting for her to ask for schematics or a briefing or at least acknowledge the chain of command. But she did none of that. Captain Joanna Brant was already striding toward her, hair whipped about by the wind, her expression unreadable but her presence unmistakable. She extended a hand as she closed the distance. "Loretta Mills," she said, voice firm but respectful. "Thank you for coming on short notice." Loretta clasped her hand briefly, her grip work-worn but without aggression. "I didn't come for thanks," she replied softly, meeting Brant's eyes with quiet intensity. "I came for the ship." Brant's lips parted slightly, caught off guard, but only for a breath. "Fair enough," she said, before stepping aside and motioning her forward. "Follow me." As they walked together, the crew fell into a stunned hush, their eyes following this civilian in the oil-stained jacket, whose boots left damp prints that seemed far too human, too ordinary for the polished modern steel beneath them. Loretta walked without looking at the walls, the pipes, the data panels glowing softly in standby mode. Instead, her head tilted ever so slightly as though listening, to the creaks, the faint hums, the silences where there should have been sound. Near the main hatch leading below, she stopped abruptly. A low vibration thrummed faintly through the bulkhead, a pulse almost imperceptible but unmistakable to anyone who knew how to feel for it. She laid a hand flat against the steel, fingers splayed wide. She closed her eyes, let the cold seep into her palm, and stood completely still. A sailor nearby couldn't help himself and whispered to his companion, "What the hell is she doing? She hasn't even asked for a system log." Loretta opened her eyes slowly and turned to Brant. "Feels too quiet," she murmured, her voice half thoughtful, half wary. Brant nodded slowly, unsure what exactly Loretta meant, but she trusted it anyway. Loretta's next words were almost too soft for anyone to hear, but those closest caught them and felt a strange chill. "She's hiding," Loretta said. "She's not broken, she's just scared." Without waiting for permission, without asking a single question about security clearances or protocols, Loretta stepped through the hatch into the heart of the ship, her notebook tucked under one arm, her stethoscope swaying gently against her chest. Behind her, sailors watched in silence, their skepticism mingling with something they hadn't felt in days. The first fragile stirrings of hope. The engine room was dense with heat and tension, heavy air laced with the sharp tang of scorched insulation and the bitter memory of every failed attempt. 10 engineers in sweat-darkened uniforms hovered near darkened consoles, arms folded tightly, eyes narrowed at the sight of Loretta Mills stepping across the threshold as if she belonged there. Her boots rang softly against the grated steel floor as she crossed into the space that had defeated the smartest minds in the fleet. She didn't pause to greet anyone, didn't ask for diagnostics or schematics. She moved directly toward the dead core, a towering lattice of turbines, relays, and cables that had fallen silent 3 days ago, but still seemed to radiate defiance. Commander Raj Patel stepped forward, tablet clutched against his chest like a shield. "Ms. Mills, we've already run every known diagnostic." Loretta raised a hand, palm outward but gentle, stopping him mid-sentence without a word. Her face was calm, distant, as though his voice was just another background noise in a room filled with more important signals. She slipped the battered stethoscope from around her neck and with a small, reverent gesture placed its cracked rubber bell gently against the casing of a primary junction. Then she closed her eyes and went completely still, so still that the room itself seemed to lean toward her in involuntary curiosity. Seconds passed, then half a minute. Someone coughed nervously and a young tech muttered under his breath, "Seriously, she's just going to listen?" But Loretta didn't waver. She was somewhere far away now, deep inside a memory that lived in the sound she heard. A low, uneven thrum beneath cold steel, a rhythm out of sync, like a heart afraid to beat properly. This was the sound she knew. Her father's voice echoed faintly in her mind. "When an engine locks itself up and won't speak to you, it ain't always busted. Sometimes it's protecting itself from you." Loretta pressed her palm flat next to the stethoscope and tapped lightly 3 times, letting the vibration roll back into her fingertips. Her brow furrowed. Then she spoke, quietly to no one in particular. "You replaced a capacitor after the last cycle down, didn't you?" Patel froze. Hannah Ruiz, the civilian systems tech, frowned and quickly swiped through logs on her tablet. "That's standard procedure," she said defensively. "We followed protocols exactly, all specs correct, latest revision." Loretta opened her eyes and shook her head slightly, sadness softening her face. "Latest revision, yes, but not original design." She turned and crouched near a panel below the cooling relay, fingertips running lightly over its surface until she found a tiny seam. Without asking, she grabbed a nearby driver and undid 4 screws with quick, deft movements, popping the cover free. Inside, A small bank of capacitors gleamed under dim auxiliary lights, but one glint of metal caught her eye immediately. Wrong in shape, too clean, too new. She pointed without hesitation. That one, right there. It's not what this system was built with. It's what the documentation thinks should be here, but this ship remembers otherwise. A ripple of disbelief spread through the room. Patel crouched beside her, examining the part closely. How can you possibly know that? We sourced every component from approved supply chains. Loretta's fingers brushed over the offending part, feeling not just the difference in material, but the way its presence disrupted the flow of energy she had traced through the machine's body. Because it echoes, she said softly, eyes locking onto Patel's. That capacitor type creates a resonance loop when paired with this specific core configuration. The AI never learned about it because that substitution happened during prototype trials, before the specs were finalized. Your diagnostics can't see it, but the ship can feel it. The silence that followed was profound. One of the senior engineers, Riley Brent, crossed his arms tightly, voice clipped with skepticism. That's just folklore, he scoffed. Engines don't feel anything. Machines don't remember. Loretta turned to him slowly, gaze steady but calm. They remember the hands that built them, she said simply. And they remember what feels wrong, even if you don't. Her hand hovered briefly over the stethoscope, listening one final time. Then she stood, wiping her palms on her windbreaker, and spoke with quiet authority. You're not broken, she murmured, as if addressing the ship itself. You're just trying to protect yourself from bad information. She stepped back and looked directly at Captain Brandt, who had entered the room moments before, observing the entire exchange without interrupting. I can fix this, Loretta said plainly, but I need someone to pull that part carefully and bring me a substitute from the comms relay housing. It won't match the manual either, but it will match her memory. Brandt didn't hesitate. Do it, she ordered, her voice cutting clean through the haze of doubt. As the crew scrambled into motion, following the directions of a woman they had doubted mere minutes before, a strange new atmosphere filled the engine room, not one of certainty but of fragile hope. For the first time in days, someone had spoken to the USS Hian, not as a problem to be solved, but as a being to be heard. And Loretta Mills, armed with nothing more than her father's notebook, an old stethoscope, and a lifetime of listening, had finally uncovered the truth everyone else had missed. The engine room bustled with hesitant motion now, half reluctant, half relieved, engineers and technicians glancing at one another as if waiting for permission to believe what was happening. At the center of it all, Loretta Mills knelt on the steel deck, tools unrolled neatly beside her, notebook open to a page covered in grease-smudged sketches and faded handwritten notes, some of which looked like they could have been written decades ago by hands not her own. Her fingers moved without hesitation, selecting tools that looked almost too small for the job ahead, their handles worn smooth from use. The old windbreaker she wore had slipped off one shoulder, revealing a sweat-ducking t-shirt beneath, but she didn't bother to adjust it. Her attention was wholly absorbed by the broken interface, as if the weight of the crew's skepticism didn't matter. Not to her, and certainly not to the machine before her. Petty Officer Jake Morris crouched nearby, holding the salvaged part from the comms relay in both hands as if it were glass. His young face was pale, eyes flicking nervously from Lorette to the surrounding officers, who still hovered just outside the reach of her quiet authority. Set it here, Loretta instructed softly, patting a folded rag beside her as she finished desoldering the faulty capacitor. Her voice was so calm, so matter-of-fact, that it momentarily silenced the whispers at the edges of the room. Morris knelt carefully, placing the component exactly where she had indicated. "You really think this is it?" he asked, voice low as if afraid to speak too loudly in front of the silent ship. Loretta offered a faint smile. Not arrogant, but tired and steady. "I don't think," she murmured. "I listen." She picked up her soldering iron and paused just long enough to glance at Morris. "And she's been telling me what she needs since the moment I stepped on deck." Commander Raj Patel watched closely, arms still crossed, but something in his expression had softened, a crack forming in his shield of skepticism, though pride kept him silent. Hannah Ruiz stood near the diagnostics terminal, tablet held tightly in both hands, her eyes darting between the sensor logs and Loretta's careful work, unable to reconcile the lack of data with what was unfolding before her. Near the back of the room, Riley Brent scoffed under his breath but offered no further challenge. Even he seemed unable to muster more than a grim resignation now. Loretta worked slowly, deliberately. The hiss of molten solder touching the capacitor legs filled the space, a small sound that felt larger than the low murmur of the circulating fans. Every movement she made seemed weighted with care, as if rushing would offend the machine itself. "Don't force it," she whispered, almost to herself but loud enough for Morris to hear. "These wires, they remember who touched them last. Treat them like you would an old friend who hasn't spoken in a while." Morris nodded wordlessly, his skepticism fading into a kind of quiet awe. When the solder cooled and Loretta had finished wrapping the shielding tape with hands so steady they seemed detached from the tension around her, she leaned back on her heels and took a breath, not of relief, but of patience. Captain Brandt had stepped forward now, arms folded but her gaze fixed, unwavering. "Are we ready?" she asked. Loretta shook her head gently. "Almost. One more thing." She stood and pressed the flat of her palm against the main engine casing, eyes half closed again. The room held its collective breath as she tapped once, slightly, almost playfully, against the steel. "Let her breathe before you ask her to move," Loretta said, directing the instruction at Patel but meaning it for all of them. Then she turned back to Captain Brandt, nodding once. "Now we're ready." Brandt looked to Patel, who hesitated only a second before turning back to the console. "Restart primary cycle," he called out. A tremor ran through the deck plates, soft at first, tentative, as if the ship itself was waking slowly from a long sleep. Then a deeper hum followed, rolling beneath their boots, resonating through the walls and bulkheads. Lights on the diagnostics panel flickered, sputtered, then steadied into green. Auxiliary relays cycled to life. Cooling pumps began their steady thrum. Hannah Ruiz's voice cracked slightly as she read from her tablet. "Core temperature stabilizing, propulsion interface online." Morris exhaled sharply, face breaking into an irrepressible grin as he called out, "Captain, we're moving!" The ship's vibration shifted from idle to intention, subtle but undeniable. For the first time in nearly 4 days, the USS Hian began to glide forward, not lurching, not faltering, but smoothly, confidently, almost gratefully. And yet, even as this miracle unfolded, eyes continued to watch Loretta from across the room, not with admiration just yet, but with something closer to reluctant respect. She had done what none of them had expected. She had made the impossible look simple, made their arrogance look fragile. But she hadn't done it for them. She hadn't come for praise or acknowledgement. Loretta simply reached for her battered notebook and stethoscope, slipping them both back into her windbreaker pocket. She had done it for the ship, and the ship at last was breathing again. The USS Hian glided forward beneath the gray Pacific sky, her engines humming steady now, her systems checking green one by one. The vibration through the deck felt alive again, quiet but confident, as though the ship itself was grateful to return from the dead. In the control room, Lieutenant Darby's hands hovered tentatively above the helm controls, his voice cracking with disbelief as he called out, "Captain, propulsion holding steady, no drag, power curves rising to nominal parameters." Across the deck, sailors moved with a different gait now, slightly faster, more upright, but their eyes still carried the fatigue of those who had nearly accepted failure. In the engine room, Loretta Mills stood near the primary junction, her work complete, her tools neatly rolled and stowed, but her presence still drawing uneasy glances. Commander Patel approached slowly, his tone caught somewhere between admiration and discomfort. "It's working," he said. "She's holding steady." Loretta didn't look at him. Instead, she placed her palm one last time on the cooling relay, feeling the steady thrum beneath her fingertips. "She's not just working," she murmured. "She's trusting you again. Don't break that trust next time." But even as hope rippled quietly through the ship's decks, a different current was already forming, one colder, more calculating. Captain Joanna Brandt stood near the comms console, holding a secure tablet in both hands. The message displayed was terse but unmistakable. "Urgent, provide immediate explanation for civilian access to engine ore, violations under review, prepare for full debrief upon return." Brandt's jaw tightened. The ship might be alive again, but command wasn't celebrating. In Washington and at Point Loma, admirals would already be rewriting the narrative, searching for explanations, deciding who would be blamed, not praised, for this miracle. Patel's voice broke her focus. "Captain," he said quietly, "we need to talk about how this looks. There's going to be questions." Brandt nodded slowly. "There always are," she replied. Her eyes flicked toward Loretta, still crouched near the core, brushing soot from her windbreaker, indifferent to the attention, unmoved by the skepticism that clung to every stare in the room. Lieutenant Darby leaned close to Patel and whispered, "This isn't over. They'll say it was a systems anomaly. They'll minimize this. They'll bury it." Patel didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew the truth. The Navy wouldn't want this story told as it happened. It would become something safer, something that preserved the image of expertise and flawless engineering. And Loretta? She would be a footnote at best, erased at worst. Even as the ship sailed steadily now, doubt remained. Not about her skill, but about her place in this hierarchy, this machinery of politics and prestige. Loretta felt the weight of their doubt but bore it easily. She hadn't come for their approval. She had come for the ship, and the ship was breathing. Captain Brandt stepped closer to her, voice low but sincere. "You did something extraordinary here. But you know they won't see it that way." Loretta met her gaze, eyes calm, voice even softer than before. "I didn't do it for them, Captain. I did it for her," she said, nodding gently toward the engine. Brandt hesitated, then let out a quiet breath, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for days. The Hian was alive again, but the story of how she had been saved would be contested, downplayed, perhaps even rewritten. And as sailors filed quietly out of the engine room, their faces a mixture of gratitude and unease, Loretta remained where she was for one last moment, alone with the machine she had coaxed back from silence, perfectly aware that doubt would follow her long after this day ended. But for now, she simply rested her hand one final time against the steel and whispered so low that only she and the ship could hear, "You're home again." The corridors of the USS Hian buzzed with the low murmur of restored systems and cautious relief. Sailors moved quicker now, their steps regaining rhythm, their backs just slightly straighter. But beneath the surface hum of machinery and chatter, another tension simmered. The weight of questions that command would soon ask, and the knowledge that this strange victory had no clear place in the Navy's polished narratives. In a quiet corner of the lower deck, away from the main passageways, Petty Officer Jake Morris lingered awkwardly outside the makeshift workspace where Loretta Mills was gathering her tools. The battered leather notebook lay open on the bench beside her, its grease-smudged pages fluttering gently in the ship's new breath of air. Morris cleared his throat, but didn't speak immediately. Loretta noticed him, but kept working, folding the worn cloth that held her tools with slow, deliberate care. Finally, he stepped closer, speaking in a voice not much above a whisper. "Can I ask you something?" Loretta didn't look up but nodded. "Go ahead." Morris hesitated, struggling to find words that felt adequate. "How did you know?" "Not just about the capacitor, the whole thing. How did you know how this system would react when none of us could see it?" For a long moment Loretta said nothing. Then she closed the notebook gently and turned to face him, leaning her hip against the bench. Her gaze was steady but kind, the fatigue in her eyes tempered by something older and quieter than exhaustion, something like grace. "You've been trained to read what's on a screen," she said softly, "and that's good. But machines don't just tell you the truth because you ask the right questions on a console. They reveal themselves if you let them." Morris listened intently, his brow furrowed, the skepticism gone now, replaced by curiosity tinged with humility. Loretta continued, voice low and even, meant only for him. "My father taught me before I could hold a wrench properly. Don't trust a reading until you've put your hand on the metal. Don't trust a smooth hum until you've listened for the hesitation behind it." She picked up the old stethoscope, holding it out toward Morris, letting the cracked rubber tubing sway slightly between them. "This," she said, voice almost tender, "this isn't just a tool. It's an act of respect. You're telling the machine, I'm listening. I'm not rushing. I'm not assuming." Morris swallowed hard, eyes lowering briefly as he absorbed the weight of her words. "Can anyone learn that?" he asked quietly. Loretta smiled, a small smile, tired but genuine. "You already started," she said simply. "You stayed and watched when everyone else doubted. You're asking now. Next time something breaks, get quiet first, really quiet. Let the machine speak in its own language. Then you'll hear what no screen will ever show you." Without ceremony, she placed the notebook, her father's notebook full of sketches, annotations, and fingerprints from decades of quiet mastery, into Morris's hands. "Take this," she said. "Copy what you need, but don't treat it like gospel. Treat it like a conversation that's still unfinished. Add your notes, your lessons, your mistakes, then one day give it to someone else who asks the same question." Morris looked down at the notebook, his fingers brushing its worn cover as though it might dissolve in his grip. "I will," he whispered, voice thick with emotion he couldn't fully name. Loretta reached out, clapped a hand gently on his shoulder, a quiet, grounding gesture. "Keep asking the hard questions, Morris," she said, meeting his gaze one last time, "even when no one else wants to hear them." Then she turned away, her boot sounding soft but certain against the deck as she walked toward the exit, the hum of the Hian steady beneath her feet. The lesson she had passed on was simple but profound. Listening wasn't just a skill, it was a responsibility. And while the Navy's reports might never mention her name, that notebook, and the habit it represented, would continue sailing forward, quiet but alive, in the hands of the next generation. The helicopter sat idling on the deck, its rotors slow but insistent, wind curling through the rails, stirring uniforms and stray papers. Loretta Mills stood near the open cabin door, her windbreaker zipped halfway, the battered stethoscope and empty tool roll tucked under one arm. The same skepticism that had greeted her arrival still hovered around the deck, but now softened, reshaped into something quieter, harder to name. Captain Joanna Brandt approached, her expression unreadable at first, until the shadow of a smile touched her lips. There were no grand speeches, no medals offered, no salutes exchanged. Just two women who had carried the weight of this ship's silence and brought it back together. For now. Brant held something in her hand, a small, oil-darkened wrench wrapped in cloth, the one Loretta had carried tucked into her jacket when she boarded, the one that had belonged to her father. "I can't take this," Brant said quietly, pressing it back toward Loretta. "It's yours." But Loretta shook her head gently, curling Brant's fingers around the worn steel. "It's not for you," she said, voice soft but steady. "It's for the next sailor who thinks they're too young to be right and too old to keep learning. Keep it somewhere no one forgets why it matters." Brant nodded slowly, closing her hand around the wrench like it was a promise. The rotors kicked up spray along the deck as Loretta stepped into the cabin, but before the crew could look away, she turned and spoke, not to Brant, not to Patel or Darby, not even to Morris, but as if addressing the ship itself. "You've got a good ship here, Captain. She just needed someone to remember how to listen." The helicopter lifted, wheels clearing the deck in a slow arc, as sea and sky folded together beneath her. Loretta didn't look back. She didn't need to. The ship was breathing again, and that was enough. 2 days later, back in Norfolk, Loretta sat at the workbench in her father's old garage, elbows resting on scarred wood, the hum of a rusted fan pushing warm air lazily around the room. The wrench was gone now, left behind as a quiet reminder aboard the USS Hian. But the notebook was not. Not the old one. In front of her lay a clean notebook, blank, its spine still stiff. She uncapped a pen slowly, thoughtfully, and on the first page wrote 5 words. "Things the ship won't tell you." Below that, she began her list. Not specs, not diagrams. Truths. The sound of a good engine turning bad is softer than you expect. A cooling line doesn't squeal when it's about to rupture, it goes quiet. If it feels different, it probably is. She filled one page, then another, and another. As evening fell and the streetlights flickered on outside, Loretta leaned back, closed the notebook gently, and smiled. Not out of pride, but out of purpose. The wrench was gone. The old notebook had passed into another's hands. But the habit remained. Somewhere aboard the USS Hian, sailors would speak quietly of what they had witnessed. The civilian who came aboard with nothing but an old windbreaker, a stethoscope, and an instinct no machine could replicate. And maybe, just maybe, one day when another system failed, when the screens all went dark, someone would remember. Maybe it would be Morris. Maybe it would be one of the young engineers who had watched silently from the shadows. Or maybe it would be the next sailor, looking at the small wrench mounted quietly in the engine room, a plaque below it reading, "This tool once stopped a warship from going silent." Loretta turned off the workshop light and let the hum of quiet settle around her. In the hush that followed, there was no applause, no commendation, no audience, but the lesson lingered, as it always did, waiting for those ready to hear it. And that was enough.